the heat-scorched plains of the vast conservation area shimmered at dawn, a brutal, beautiful canvas of brittle gold and shadow. The air was still, heavy with dust, tasting of parched earth and desperation. Life here clung to a thread. A flicker of movement caught the eye, a cheetah mother, Amani, her once elegant frame now a skeletal map of hunger. Behind her, 3 tiny cubs stumbled, their desperate mews swallowed by the immense silence. Observing from a dusty Land Rover, wildlife biologist Dr. Elias Vance watched, his face a mask of professional grief. Beside him, his teenage son, Leo, saw not a data point, but a dying family. This was the edge of existence. The mother's ribs were a cage holding a heart that beat only for the 3 small lives behind her. She had not eaten. Inside the Land Rover, the silence that followed Amani's retreat was heavy, charged with an unfamiliar electricity. Elias sat rigid, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. His mind, usually a fortress of objective data and scientific protocols, reeled, searching for an explanation, a biological imperative for such an unprecedented act. Had the cheetah been disoriented by hunger? Was it a desperate, misinterpreted warning? He cycled through hypotheses, each one failing to account for the deliberate, almost intentional quality of her gaze. Beside him, Leo pulled his hand away from the dashboard, his young face etched with an unfamiliar intensity. "Dad," he had said, his voice barely a whisper, "she's asking for help." Elias had dismissed it, then. His scientific mind had continued its relentless cataloging of data, species, age, condition, probability of survival. The cheetah's desperate plea, however, had burned a new kind of data point into his memory, something beyond the realm of scientific explanation. The image of her eyes, an amber question in the face of inevitable starvation, had become a living thing within him, refusing to be filed away. The stark facts of the morning offered no solace. They had found Amani and her cubs huddled under a lone acacia, bodies now even more gaunt, movement minimal. The smallest cub, tiny, shivered visibly. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the professional grief he usually compartmentalized. But this grief was different now. It was sharpened by the memory of those eyes, by Leo's simple, damning observation. Back at their field tent, a canvas against the relentless sun, Elias pored over the worn pages of his conservation guidelines. The ink was stark, unyielding. Non-intervention is the primary directive. He muttered the words aloud, a mantra he'd lived by his entire career. Interfering could cause dependency, disrupt the fragile ecosystem, risk human safety, create a precedent. He recited the rationale, not just for Leo, but for himself, trying to rebuild the fortress of his objectivity. But Leo, not looking up from sharpening his knife, cut through it all with brutal honesty. The rulebook didn't see her look at you, Dad. That night, sleep was a battlefield. Elias tossed, haunted by Amani's gaze, by the way her head had tilted, an almost human gesture. He saw his own past failures, the moments when nature's brutality had been absolute, and he had learned to accept it, to retreat into the sterile certainty of non-intervention. It was safer, cleaner. But the ghost of Amani's plea whispered against his resolve, questioning every principle he held dear. Finally, a flicker of an idea, a compromise born of desperation, began to form. He couldn't feed them directly, that was outright forbidden. But he could relocate a resource, a fresh roadkill carcass, a gazelle they'd spotted on their morning rounds, to a location on Amani's likely migration path. It could be framed, he rationalized, as an ecological opportunity, or a strategic dispersal of nutrients to prevent scavenging in unsafe areas. A loophole, thin as parchment, but a loophole nonetheless. As the vast African sky bled into the deep blues of dusk, painting the horizon in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Elias and Leo moved with a hushed reverence. The Land Rover crawled across the uneven terrain, its headlights off, the engine a low growl against the encroaching silence. The gazelle, heavy and still, lay in the back. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he and Leo carefully offloaded the carcass, placing it with deliberate care near a cluster of low scrub, several hundred yards from where they'd last seen Amani's tracks. It felt illicit, sacred. Elias looked around, scanning the darkening plains, as if expecting to be caught in the act. He was crossing a line, not just professional, but existential, one that challenged everything he believed about his place in the wild. They retreated to a distant copy, the Land Rover now a dark silhouette against the last vestiges of light. Hours passed. The moon rose, bathing the landscape in an ethereal silver glow. Elias held his binoculars, the world through them a shimmering, uncertain canvas. Amani was a ghost at the edge of his vision, a flicker of movement, then stillness. She circled the offering, a dozen times, perhaps more, her body language a taut wire of suspicion and hunger. The cubs, too weak to follow, lay huddled nearby. Elias held his breath, Leo's hand gripping his arm. The silence of the plains was immense, charged with a primal tension. Finally, with a soft chuff that seemed to break the immense silence, Amani took her first tentative step towards the dark mass of the gazelle. Her body remained a taut wire, every muscle coiled, but hunger, fierce and overwhelming, had won. The cubs, seeing their mother move, stirred with faint hope. Amani tore at the flesh, then pulled a piece away for them. It was a ritual of desperate survival, brutal and beautiful in its necessity. They ate, slowly at first, then with an urgency that clawed at Elias's throat, a silent affirmation of life clinging to the edge. Days bled into a fragile week. The gazelle had bought them time, a precious, fleeting reprieve. The cubs, though still slender, moved with a little more purpose. They practiced their wobbly sprints, chasing imaginary prey through the brittle, sun-baked grass. Amani watched, her amber eye softened by a flicker of pride, her gaunt frame still a testament to the hardship but no longer a map of immediate death. The landscape, however, remained as unforgiving as ever. The sky was an endless, unyielding blue. No clouds gathered. No rain fell. The temporary oasis of food was just that, temporary. It was a brief, beautiful illusion of recovery, not a cure. Elias noted the increased vigor in his log, but his heart knew the truth of the barren plains. Then, the smallest cub, Tiny, began to falter. He was always the most delicate, the last to reach the food, the first to tire. Now, his short bursts of play grew shorter. His leaps became stumbles. Amani noticed first. She always noticed. She would stop, looking back, waiting. Tiny lagged. He lagged again. Amani would nudge him, a gentle push with her nose, urging him forward. Her calls grew more insistent, low chirps of encouragement, then deeper, anxious chuffs. Tiny stumbled. He tried to keep up. He couldn't. One searing afternoon, as the sun hammered down, Tiny collapsed. He simply crumpled into the dusty earth, his legs giving out, his small body trembling. Amani stopped. She turned back. She ran to him, circling him, nudging him again and again, her desperation palpable. He didn't move. She lay down beside him, shielding his tiny form with her own emaciated body, her head resting near his. She refused to move. She would not abandon him. This was her choice. A choice born of fierce, instinctual love. But to stay was to die. To leave was to break a bond that transcended mere survival. This was a death sentence for them all if they didn't keep moving, if they didn't find the next scrap, the next fleeting chance. Elias and Leo watched from the Land Rover, a crushing distance away. Elias's hands trembled as he adjusted his binoculars, the image of Amani, resolute and broken, filling his vision. Leo buried his face in his hands, a choked sound escaping his throat. Elias, the scientist, found his field notes becoming a diary of grief, the sterile lines blurring with unshed tears. He scribbled, his hand shaking, "The bond is too strong. She will not abandon him." He felt the full, devastating weight of his limited ability to help, his carefully constructed walls crumbling under the sheer, heartbreaking strength of a mother's love. As dusk falls, Amani lets out a low, mournful call over her still cub. Elias puts down his binoculars, unable to watch anymore. The low, mournful call Amani let out over her still cub was a sound Elias would carry forever, a keening testament to a mother's unending grief. He had dropped his binoculars, the image of her slumped form, shielding the lifeless Tiny with her own body, too much to bear. Darkness had swallowed the plains, bringing with it a deceptive quiet, a silence that felt less like peace and more like holding its breath. Leo, slumped beside him, was equally withdrawn, his usual teenage energy replaced by a heavy, somber stillness. They sat, two human witnesses to a tragedy they were forbidden to prevent, surrounded by the vast, indifferent night. But the night was not as indifferent as they believed. A faint, acrid smell, a musky warning of carrion and opportunism, began to drift through the open window of the Rover. Elias's head snapped up. He hadn't just smelled it, he had felt it, a primal shift in the air. Then came the sound. First, a distant, whooping cackle, thin and reedy, carried on the night breeze. Then another, closer, followed by a chorus, growing in number, growing in volume. Hyenas. A clan. Drawn by the scent of weakness, by the promise of an easy meal. Elias fumbled for his binoculars again, sweeping the lens across the moonlit expanse. He found them, a shifting mass of shadows on the horizon, moving with predatory purpose, their powerful forms low to the ground. They were heading directly for Amani. Amani, despite her profound exhaustion and grief, registered the shift. Her ears swiveled, her head rising from her prostrate cub. Her eyes, luminous in the dark, narrowed on the approaching threat. She rose, slowly, painfully, her ribs a jagged silhouette against the sliver of moonlight. She was a ghost of her former self, but the instinct to protect was a fire that burned brighter than any hunger. She positioned herself, a lone, skeletal warrior, between her two surviving cubs and the encroaching pack, a desperate, defiant wall of sinew and bone. The hyenas, emboldened by her obvious weakness, did not hesitate. Their whoops grew into a cacophony, a chilling symphony of imminent death. They fanned out, circling, testing, their dark eyes gleaming. One darted forward, then another. Amani snarled, a rasping, hoarse sound, lunging with surprising speed, but she was too slow, too weak, too outnumbered. They closed in. It was clear. Amani could not win. This was not the law of the wild, this was a brutal, unfair slaughter. "Dad! Do something!" Leah's voice, raw with terror and outrage, ripped through the suffocating silence of the Rover. It wasn't a question. It was a command. A plea that tore through every professional boundary Elias had ever erected, every ethical guideline he had ever memorized. The rules, the regulations, the non-intervention directive, they were meaningless now, dissolved in the terrifying reality of teeth and claws closing in on a mother and her young. This was the point of no return. Elias didn't think. He didn't weigh consequences. He acted. His hand flew to the emergency kit, snatching the flare gun. In one fluid motion, a decision carved from pure adrenaline, he flung open the door, vaulted onto the hood of the Land Rover, and aimed for the sky. The crack of the flare gun shattered the night, a deafening thunderclap that echoed across the plains. A brilliant, searing red flare shot upwards, exploding into a shower of incandescent sparks that hung in the air, bathing the landscape in an unearthly, violent crimson light. The sudden noise, the blinding flash, it was too much for the hyenas. Their predatory focus broke. They yelped, startled, scattering immediately, their whoops replaced by confused whimpers as they vanished back into the enveloping darkness. Silence returned to the plains, stark and absolute. Amani looked towards the vehicle, then back at her cubs, safer now. Elias was breathing heavily, the flare gun still in his hand. Elias's heavy breathing slowly calmed, the flare gun feeling heavier in his hand than it had a moment ago. The plains, plunged back into the deep, inky black, seemed to hold its breath. Amani, a ghost in the dim light, turned her head, fixing him with a gaze that held no menace, only a quiet, ancient understanding. She had seen. She had accepted. He lowered the flare gun, the metallic click loud in the renewed silence. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. Hours later, the sun a thin sliver of orange on the horizon, Elias sat in the Land Rover, his satellite phone a cold weight in his hand. He hesitated, then dialed. The crackle of the connection was followed by Dr. Ramirez's crisp, unyielding voice. Elias kept his tone clipped, professional, describing the situation in clinical terms. Report: observed opportunistic hyena predation attempt on cheetah family. Discharged 1 deterrent flare. Incident concluded with no animal injury. A massive understatement, a sterile summary of a near tragedy and a profound moral earthquake. Ramirez's voice, devoid of warmth, promised a formal review, a deep probe into the regulations. The professional stakes, Elias knew, were now dangerously high. His career, his entire life's work built on non-intervention, hung in the balance. Yet, a strange peace settled within him. The next morning, the proof of his defiance lay before him. Amani, with her 2 surviving cubs, tiny, miraculously, having made it through the night, albeit still fragile, rested barely 50 yards from their parked Land Rover. She no longer bristled at their presence. She didn't flee when Leo coughed or Elias adjusted his camera. Instead, she lay in the sparse shade of a thorn tree, occasionally glancing their way, her amber eyes holding a newfound, almost weary acceptance. It was a shared world now. Elias and Leo spent their days in quiet communion, simply being present, observing the subtle shifts in the cheetahs. Shifts in the cheetah's behavior. But even as the bond deepened, the relentless sun beat down, and the arid air promised no end to the drought. Until, one bruised purple afternoon, a low rumble vibrated through the Land Rover's frame, not from the engine, but from the heavens themselves. Elias looked up, his expression unreadable, as the first dark, heavy clouds began to gather, boiling on the distant horizon. The air grew still, charged with an electric tension. Then, a single, fat drop splattered on the dusty windshield, followed by another, and another, until a sudden deluge roared down, drumming a triumphant rhythm on the roof. The parched earth hissed, drinking deeply, exhaling a rich, forgotten scent of life. It was a symbolic cleansing, a literal turning point, washing away not just the dust of the plains, but the lingering shadows of despair. Days bled into weeks. The land, once brittle gold, underwent a miraculous transformation. A time-lapse blur of green shoots pushed through the cracked soil, carpeting the plains in a vibrant emerald. Waterholes, once stagnant puddles, swelled into sparkling oases, reflecting the cerulean sky. The cubs, revitalized by consistent meals Elias continued to relocate, and the renewed vigor in Amani's milk, now chased each other through the tall, swaying grass with reckless abandon. Tiny, once so frail, bounded with a boundless energy, tumbling over his siblings, his small chirps now robust and joyful. Elias and Leo watched these scenes unfold, their own quiet joy mirroring the resurgence of life around them. They spoke less, simply sharing the awe, their gazes often meeting in a silent acknowledgement of the miracle unfolding before their eyes. The landscape was healing, and so, too, were they. Then came the morning when Amani, her frame no longer skeletal but lean and powerful, stalked with a renewed purpose. They had not intervened with food for days, trusting the rains would bring back the prey. And they had. A herd of impala grazed cautiously in the distance, their movements jittery. Amani melted into the new green, a ripple of spots against the emerald canvas. Elias raised his binoculars, a thrill of anticipation running through him. She was magnificent, a creature perfected by eons of evolution. A sudden burst of speed, a blur of motion, and then, the decisive, powerful takedown. It was swift, clinical, and utterly breathtaking. Elias and Leo watched in silent reverence as she secured her kill, then called her cubs. The sight of her providing for her family, her independence restored, filled Elias with an overwhelming sense of pride. This was the wild, whole and magnificent, precisely as it should be. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Amani lay stretched out on a grassy knoll, her 3 cubs nestled close to her, their bellies full, their eyes heavy with contentment. One cub playfully batted at her ear, eliciting a soft chuff. Elias and Leo sat a short distance away in the Land Rover, the engine off, enveloped in the profound quiet. There was no need for binoculars now, the scene was etched directly onto their hearts. The Cheetah family was whole and healthy, a testament to resilience and an impossible Plea answered. The human family, too, was connected, content, and at peace. This was a perfect, earned peace, a moment suspended in time, fragile and beautiful. The family of cheetahs, silhouetted against a vibrant sunset, a perfect picture of wild beauty restored. The quiet harmony, that perfect, earned peace, felt suspended, a fragile glass orb held delicately against the vast, indifferent sky. Then, a disruption. A distant speck on the horizon grew, churning dust across the re-greening plains. It was a vehicle, not their familiar Land Rover, but a bulkier, greener model, marked with the insignia of the Maine Conservation Authority. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had filed the necessary reports, detailed the unprecedented intervention, the flair, the supplemental ecological opportunity he'd created. He had known this moment would come, but it still struck him like a physical blow, shattering the illusion of their isolated sanctuary. The vehicle pulled alongside theirs, the engine cutting with a decisive thud. A man emerged, tall and composed, his face sun-weathered but his demeanor all business. He was Dr. Aries Thorne, a senior biologist Elias knew by reputation, pragmatic, unyielding to sentiment, but fair. He offered a curt nod, then a commendation. "Vance, your reports have been thorough. And your actions, unconventional, but effective. The tracking data confirms a remarkable recovery for Amani and her cubs." The words should have brought warmth, but they carried an undercurrent of official gravity. Thorne's gaze swept across the vibrant plains, then settled back on Elias. "However, your intervention has also proven what we suspected from the outset. This area, particularly for a cheetah population, is no longer viable." Elias already knew the unspoken conclusion. He'd seen it in the way Amani no longer fully flared at their approach, in the cub's innocent curiosity when the Land Rover rumbled near. "The family," Thorne continued, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with professional pronouncement, "has become habituated to human presence. To leave them here would be to condemn them to a future of dependency, or worse, conflict with encroaching settlements." Leo, who had been listening in silent dread, finally spoke, his voice thin. "But they're thriving now. Look at them." He gestured towards Amani, a picture of health as she watched her cubs stalk an imaginary prey. Thorne offered a small, sympathetic sigh. "Thriving, yes. But no longer truly wild in this specific context. For their long-term survival, to preserve the very wildness you fought to save, Amani and her cubs must be relocated." The words hung in the air, a sentence delivered with the quiet authority of scientific necessity. "They'll be moved to the KwaZulu National Park," Thorne stated, pointing vaguely east. "Hundreds of miles from here. A vast, remote wilderness, with an established prey base and minimal human interaction." Elias felt Leo flinch beside him. The boy's face crumpled, the joy of the past weeks draining away, replaced by a devastating sorrow. "We saved them, just to say goodbye," Leo whispered, his voice cracking, the bitter irony a raw, open wound. Elias could only put a hand on his son's shoulder, offering a comfort he himself couldn't find. The decision was absolute. Their success had created this impossible choice. Elias looked at the official translocation order, the black and white text sealing their fate. The next morning, the air hung heavy and still, not with the familiar dust of the plains, but with a palpable sense of impending loss. A second Land Rover, emblazoned with the Conservation Authority's insignia, rumbled into their camp, stirring the ground. Out stepped Dr. Anya Sharma, a calm, competent veterinarian with compassionate eyes, and her small, efficient team. Elias moved with them, a ghost in his own professional skin, assisting with the assembly of the specialized transport crate, checking the tranquilizer darts, preparing the tracking collar. His hands were steady, his movements precise, a lifetime of training kicking in to override the profound ache in his chest. Every click of a buckle, every hiss of compressed air from the dart gun, was a hammer blow to his already fractured composure. Leo, usually an active participant, stood quietly by their rover, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge where Amani and her cubs had last been seen. He understood that this was not a rescue, but a necessary severing. For the final day, no cameras were raised, no field note scrawled. Elias and Leo simply watched. From a respectful distance, they observed Amani teaching her cubs the subtle art of stalking grasshoppers, the playful pounces of the two stronger siblings, the persistent, endearing clumsiness of Tiny. They memorized the flicker of Amani's tail, the proud curve of her neck, the way she would occasionally lift her head and scan the horizon, her amber eyes now full of a renewed, vigilant strength. They watched the sun climb and fall, casting long, golden shadows that stretched and shrank, marking the passage of their last shared hours in this place. It was a silent, reverent farewell, absorbing every detail, every nuance of their wild family, engraving it onto their hearts. The world felt simultaneously vast and painfully small, holding the entirety of their brief, impossible connection. As dusk deepened and the plains began to cool, the moment arrived. The vet team positioned their vehicle strategically, while Elias and Leo remained in theirs, a little further back. Dr. Sharma raised her dark gun, her movements fluid and practiced. Elias watched, his jaw tight, his breath catching in his throat. He saw Amani, oblivious, settling her cubs for the night. This was not a hunt, not a threat, but an act of profound, agonizing love. As the dart left the barrel with a soft asterisk thwip asterisk, Elias leaned forward, his voice a low, soothing murmur through the open window, directed at the cheetah. "It's okay, Amani. It's for your safety. For their future." He spoke to her as one would a beloved, bewildered child, a gentle, whispered apology for the necessary deception. The dart hit its mark, a small, dark pinprick on her powerful flank. Amani startled, a flash of surprise, then confusion. She looked directly at Elias, her eyes wide, then slowly, gracefully, her legs began to buckle. There was no fear in her gaze, no anger, only a deep, calm recognition that settled on him like a physical weight. It was a look of acknowledgement, a final, silent farewell that tore at his soul, a betrayal born of love, tearing him apart even as it affirmed their bond. He watched as her magnificent body slumped to the earth, the cubs nuzzling her in their sleepy innocence, unaware of the profound change sweeping through their world. The team moved quickly, professionally. The cubs, gently scooped up while their mother was sedated, were placed into small, individual carriers, their soft mews barely audible. Elias helped carefully lift Amani, her heavy, warm body surprisingly light in his arms, into the larger transport crate. He stroked her head once, the coarse fur familiar beneath his trembling fingers, and whispered a promise he hoped the wind would carry to her dreams. The door of the transport crate sliding shut, a sound of absolute finality. The metallic clang of the transport crate door, a sound of absolute finality, echoed not just across the plains but within Elias's very bones. He stood there, the weight of Amani's sedation, the memory of her last, tranquil gaze still heavy on his hands and heart. Leo, beside him, said nothing, merely leaned against the Land Rover, his gaze fixed on the dust trail left by the departing convoy. The vastness of the conservation area suddenly felt impossibly empty, a silent canvas where a vibrant, urgent drama had just concluded, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. Months passed. The relentless sun, which had baked the earth to a brittle shell, finally relented. Dark, heavy clouds gathered on the horizon, not as a threat, but as a promise. The first drops of rain fell, tentative at first, then a deluge, washing away the dust and the memory of drought. The plains, once a canvas of brittle gold, transformed into a vibrant tapestry of greens. Waterholes, long since evaporated, brimmed with cool, clear water. Wildebeest grazed in lush meadows, impala leapt through new grass, and the calls of birds, long silenced by the hardship, returned with a joyous chorus. The land healed, vibrant and alive, yet for Elias, a specific, resonant emptiness remained. His daily observations were still meticulous, his scientific rigor unwavering, but the familiar ache in his chest, the one that Amani's plea had initially challenged, now held a different quality, a quiet wistfulness rather than a professional detachment. He and Leo continued their work, their bond deepened by the shared experience, their conversations now woven with unspoken understandings. One crisp morning, weeks after the rains had completely reshaped the landscape, an email arrived in Elias's inbox. The subject line was stark, Amani update. He sat at his small, fold-out desk in the field tent, the familiar hum of the generator providing the only soundtrack to his racing heart. Leo, sensing the moment, moved to stand beside him, his breath held. Together, their hands trembling slightly, Elias clicked open the message. The screen filled not with text, but with an image. Amani. She stood on a rocky outcrop, framed by a boundless, green vista that stretched to the distant mountains. Her coat, once a map of hunger, was now sleek and powerful, her muscles evident beneath the glossy fur. Her amber eyes, intelligent and watchful, scanned the horizon. Beside her, not two, but three magnificent, nearly grown cubs, their spots sharp against their healthy frames, nosed through the tall grass. They were wild. They were thriving. They were free. They were exactly where they belonged. Elias and Leo looked at the photo for a long moment, then at each other. There was no sadness in their eyes now, only a profound sense of peace and gratitude, a quiet wonder at the miracle they had been privileged to witness and to save. Elias looked away from the screen, his gaze sweeping across the regenerated plains that had brought them all together. The wind whispered through the new leaves, carrying echoes of a silent plea and a bond that transcended species.